Topic 1D, rounding decimal numbers. So we know the place values for decimal numbers, we know how to round whole numbers. Putting those two things together, we can now round decimal numbers. Luckily, rounding decimal numbers isn't really much different than rounding whole numbers. We're just on the other side of the decimal point. So let's take a look at a decimal number. 0.51782. So we've got a decimal number, 51,782 hundred thousandths. Okay? And if we want to round this decimal number, we do the same thing that we would with a whole number. We go to the place value that we're trying to round to, look at the number to the right, round up if it's 5 or more, round down if it's 4 or less. We're just going to have one little change at the end that makes it different than rounding a whole number. So let's say we want to round this to the nearest hundredth. So the nearest hundredth. So we go to the hundredths place. Tenths, hundredths. We look at the number to the right, which in this case is a 7. That's 5 or greater, so we're going to round up. So we get 0.52000. Now, if you remember, we previously talked about necessary or unnecessary zeros. And this is where this comes into play, that these zeros, since they're beyond any other numbers on the right side of the decimal point, they're unnecessary. So we can get rid of them. And we have 0.52. Now the one little caveat here is, not only can we get rid of these zeros, but we have to get rid of these zeros. Because when we're on the right side of the decimal point, when we're in the decimal part of the number, if we have zeros in here, it implies that those are actually zeros. But we know that we actually had 782 there before, and we rounded to this place. So we have to get rid of those. Whereas when we were on the whole number side, if we had zeros, we kept those zeros there to get us to the ones place because they would cause our number to shift to be a smaller number. So we do have to remember to get rid of these, and then we have rounded to the nearest hundredth, 52 hundredths. We have to get rid of any zeros to the right. So let's try that again. .5798. Let's round to the nearest thousandth. To the nearest thousandth, so we have to find the thousandths place. Tenths, hundredths, thousandths. That means we're going to look at the number to the right, which is an 8. 8 causes us to round up. So you have 0.57. Oh, wait, we've got a problem. That 9 is going to become a 10, right? So that's not going to be 7-9, it's going to be 8-0. Now we have to keep this 0 because we're rounding to the nearest thousandth, and that's the tenths, the hundredths, and the thousandths place. We don't put in this one because that would be beyond the thousandths place. So that's one of the tricks we have to be careful of. When we round, we have to make sure that we have something in the actual place value. So rounding to the nearest thousandth, this is 0.580 or 580 thousandths. We can't leave it as 0.58 hundredths because that would imply that we rounded to the nearest hundredth. So that's a little caveat which we need to remember. Let's try another one, but let's put a little something extra on it. What if we have 38.0524 and we round that to the nearest hundredth? So rounding to the nearest hundredth, so we go to the tenths, hundredths, right? Look at the number to the right. The number to the right is a 2, so we're going to round down. So we have 38.05, and those become zeros that are unnecessary, and we get rid of them, and we have 38 and 5/100ths. So we rounded to the nearest hundredth. Notice that having something on the whole number side of the decimal point did not affect how we rounded on the decimal number side. Let's look at another one where we have a whole part and a decimal part. And I'm just going to switch colors for a moment. 1,584 and 0.1628, or and 1,628 hundred thousandths, tenths, hundred thousandths, 10 thousandths, 100,000, so 1,628 hundred thousandths, and we want to round this to the nearest 10. So we're rounding to the nearest 10. So we look at this and go, okay, there's the tens place. Look at the number to the right. Number to the right is a 4, which means we're going to round down. So we have 1,580. Now here's the other part of this is, if we're rounding to a whole part, when rounding a number that has a whole part and a decimal part, then the decimal part just disappears. We would still have 0.00000, right? But these are unnecessary because there's no number other than a 0 beyond them. And this decimal point would make it look like we were rounding to the nearest 1. So it becomes 1,580. So that's the other little tricky part of dealing with decimals. So if we're rounding on the decimal side, then once we get to that place value, everything beyond it is a 0 and we get rid of it. It disappears. We don't leave those zeros in there. If we're on the whole number side, then when we round, anything from the decimal point on will disappear too because we're rounding to a whole number. So that's the little trick or caveat that we have to deal with when we're rounding decimal numbers. Now what I'd like to do is mention a little bit about some special cases in rounding when you're rounding decimal places, because there's sometimes we're told certain things, round to a certain thing, and you look and go, what? What are you talking about? Sometimes we're told to round to the nearest whole number, or the nearest whole amount, or to a whole number. So when we're being told to round to the nearest whole number, to the nearest whole amount, or to a whole number, what it's really saying in all three of these cases is to round to the nearest 1. So it's basically saying round to the ones place. Anytime you have nearest whole number, nearest whole amount, whole number, it's saying round to the ones place. So if we have 653.192 and we say round to the nearest whole number, that's to the nearest 1. Look at that. Look at the 1. The 1 says round down. 653. Rounded to the nearest whole number, or rounded to a whole number. So that's one of the special cases that we run into. Another one that we run into is rounding to the nearest dollar. Well, if you're rounding to the nearest dollar, again, that's rounding to the nearest 1. Right? It's rounding to the ones place. So nearest dollar, so if I have $5.68, rounding to the nearest dollar, we're going to look at the ones place, which is the dollar amount. We're going to look at the number to the right, in this case a 6, which means we round up. So we're going to have $6. And sometimes you'll see it written like this. People go, okay, because we're used to seeing dollars with having the cents places there. At other times, you'll see it as just $6 without that. Either way is appropriate when you're dealing with rounding to the nearest dollar. The final one I'd like to mention is rounding to the nearest cent. Cent means 100. There are 100 pennies in a dollar. So when you say round to the nearest cent, you're actually saying round to the nearest hundredth. So rounding to the nearest hundredth. Now, why would we have to do that? I mean, when you're dealing with money, isn't it always in dollars and cents? How does it go further? Well, not always. If you go to the gas station and you look at the price on the pump, you'll actually see that they give it to the nearest 9/10 of a cent. If you go to the gas station, you'll see $2.67, and they actually have 9/10 over there. So you're not really paying $2.67 a gallon. You're paying $2.67 and 9/10 of a cent per gallon, which written as a decimal is 2.679. Don't worry about that conversion right now, we'll get to that later on. But you're actually looking at 2.679. Well, if I want to round that to the nearest cent, because obviously if I buy 1 gallon of gas, I can't pay them $2.679. I can't give them 9/10 of a cent. I don't have a 9/10 of a cent. So I pay them to the nearest penny. So I look at the hundredths place, that's what I'm trying to round. I look at the thousandths place, a 9 means I round up, which means it becomes 2.68. So if I were to buy a gallon of gas, I would pay $2.68. So basically, they get an extra 1/10 of a cent out of me. If I buy 10 gallons of gas, then I'd pay $26.79, and they wouldn't get any extra money out of me. But if I do anything that's not an even 10 gallons, 20 gallons, 30 gallons, then they actually get extra money out of me. So that is the other special case that we run into, rounding to the nearest cent. And that finishes up section 1D, rounding decimal numbers.